नाजरीन, परवेज़ हुद भाई एक मुश्किल सवाल के साथ हाजिर है। आज का सवाल ये है कि दुनिया की सबसे अच्छी ज़बान कौन सी है। अब हर ज़बान के बोलने वाले ये समझते हैं कि उन्हीं की ज़बान सबसे अच्छी है, लेकिन जाहिर कि ये बात दुरुस्त नहीं हो सकती, क्योंकि दुनिया में कोई 3,000 से लेकर 6,000 मुख्तलिफ ज़बानें हैं। इन सब ज़बानों से हम ख़यालात का इजहार कर सकते हैं, ख़यालात का तबादला होता है। और अब जदीद तहकीक ये बताती है कि ज़बान दरअसल दिमाग की साख्त की अलामत है, उसकी अक्कासी करती है। इस मसले पर बात करने के लिए मैं आपको अमेरिका के सबसे मशहूर दानिश्वर और माहिर लसानियात से मिलाऊंगा। इनका नाम है प्रोफेसर नोम चॉम्स्की। प्रोफेसर चॉम्स्की MIT यानी कि अमेरिका की बेहतरीन यूनिवर्सिटी और दरसगाह में पिछले 55 साल से पढ़ा रहे हैं। इनका काम इस शोबे में इतना कलीदी है कि इनको इस पूरे शोबे का बानी समझा जाता है, यानी कि मैथमेटिकल लिंग्विस्टिक्स। प्रोफेसर चॉम्स्की, thank you for giving us time. I want to begin by asking you to explain something that was really the beginning of your career and which established you as being the founder of mathematical linguistics, that is universal human grammar. What does it mean and what are its implications for people, for societies?
The term is often misunderstood. It's a borrowing from traditional usage, but in a modern sense. A universal grammar is just the genetic component of the human language faculty. Now, every capacity that we have, vision, digestive system, immune system, whatever it is, depends in part critically on a specific genetic capacity. And language is essentially an organ of the body, a recent one, incidentally. And it too has...
An organ of the body, that's very interesting. I mean, just like our hands, our feet, our eyes, in that sense?
In the general sense in which the term is loosely used in biology, the sense in which, let's say, the immune system is an organ of the body. You can't find it, you can't pick it out and extract it, it's everywhere. But it's a separate subsystem of the body which has its own properties, interacts with other subcomponents.
And you say it's common to the entire human species? It doesn't matter whether you're a European or a South Asian or an Eskimo or whatever?
We know that. In fact, if you take a child from an infant from a remote Amazonian tribe that hasn't had contact with other humans for tens of thousands of years, and you bring that infant to Boston, it'll pick up my grandchildren's language, and conversely. And it's not surprising. We're a very recent species. All humans descend from a small group that left Africa maybe 50,000 years ago. In evolutionary time, that's a flick of an eye.
But if there is such commonality between peoples, then how is it that linguistic differences are perhaps the most important political basis for divisions between people? Why don't people recognize that we have this common lineage?
Well, because if we were frogs, we would be paying attention to the differences among frogs, not to what's common to them. We'd take that for granted. And since we're humans, we pay attention to the differences among humans, not what's common to them. And what's common to them is overwhelming. In fact, there's very little genetic variation among humans. It's not just language. So there's enormous attention to color of the skin, what the hair looks like, things which are utterly superficial from a biological point of view. But among humans, that's what we pay attention to, because we take for granted what's common. Now, it happens that what's common in the case of language is just overwhelming, as it would have to be just on simple evolutionary grounds.
So these divisions are, in a sense, artificial. They're social creations.
The division, I mean, they're there, like the color of your skin is a little bit different than the color of my skin. Sure, it's there. But if a Martian biologist was looking at us the way we look at, say, the frogs, they'd say we're all identical.
a different issue. There's a strong argument being made in Pakistan that children ought to be taught in their mother tongue. There are arguments made that in this way the acquisition of ideas is optimal. You learn fastest, the child learns fastest. On the other hand, many mother tongues are insufficiently developed so that you cannot communicate modern concepts through those languages as they are in their present stage of development. This issue must exist in other parts of the world too. What are your thoughts on that?
There are arguments both ways. I mean, it's certainly true that education in one's native language, mother tongue, is going to be easier. On the other hand, it's well known that human children can easily pick up many languages simultaneously with no difficulty whatsoever. In many parts of the world, that's just normal. Like there are places in West Africa, say, where a child's father speaks one language, mother speaks a different language, aunt speaks a third language, and the child just speaks them all. So, on the other hand, the education of the mother tongue makes sense. The alleged impoverishment of languages is a very superficial affair. I mean, a language can quickly pick up, can accommodate the a vocabulary, conceptual apparatus of a more advanced civilization. In fact, that happens all the time.
When you say quickly, that means on what time scale? Because after all, we live for 60 years or so. For a language to evolve needs a very long time. Do we have that amount of time in order to...
Take the languages that have been revived. Take, say, Hebrew. Hebrew hadn't been spoken for thousands of years. Literally. It began to be revived as a spoken language in the late 19th century. I happened to learn it as a child, but the language that's now spoken in Israel is quite different from what I learned as a child, and it's an international language. Physics, mathematics, everything. It can happen quickly. It's happening right now in the Basque Country, as the language is being revived.
I don't know if you've had the opportunity of listening on to Urdu and Hindi as they are currently spoken, but if you have, then you'll notice there's a lot of English that's coming in, English words that are being introduced into the language, and sometimes it's a little painful to the ear. Some people would want to call it linguistic pollution. Now, do you think that a language ought to incorporate words of another language? I mean, what should be the rules for that? Should it be just blanket?
There aren't any. I mean, take, say, English. After the Norman conquest, English changed radically. About a large part of the vocabulary, majority of it, is Romance in origin. Okay, the language survived. Shakespeare came along, great writers and so on. Nothing wrong with the language. And the same is true of other languages. They interact in all kinds of ways.
But Shakespeare took words from Greek, from Latin. He didn't take them from Sanskrit.
He took them from French, though he didn't know it. Because after the Norman conquest, which was much earlier, a lot of the vocabulary and the structure became largely Romance. French itself is different from the other Romance languages for all kinds of reasons, in that it has a heavy Germanic element, just because of where it was and so on.
And so you wouldn't be sympathetic to the French, for example, who are very particular about keeping their language pure?
Well, I think it's a joke, frankly. But if they want to do it, okay. First, they're not keeping their language pure. They're establishing a literary standard which is artificially purified by the French Academy. It may not be the way people speak. And that's happened elsewhere. Other countries, say Germany, tried to throw out international language, replace them by German words. Countries can do this, nations can do this if they want. It's up to them, but it's pretty superficial. The languages, there's a lot of language loss, we should remember. Not just in indigenous languages, but say in Europe. There are plenty of people in, say, Italy who can't talk to their grandmother because grandmother spoke a different language.
Do you feel sad about that, that there may be something like 6,000 languages today, but there were 12,000 maybe 100 years ago.
I think
What's the loss?
A lot is lost when a language is lost. A language, I mean, as a linguist, I'm sorry to lose the evidence, but it's way beyond that. I mean, a language is part of a rich cultural system, an oral tradition, literature, a history, shared memories, shared inventions. It's a culture that's lost, and that's
yet
part
it
of
is, yet it is also the occasion or the basis for divisions and distinctions between people.
Doesn't have to be. So, for example, my native language and yours are different, but we get along fine. And that's true all over the world. In fact, one thing that's happening in Europe, which is interesting, is that along with the rapid disappearance of what we call dialects, there are actually different languages throughout Europe, there's also a revival of languages. So, for example, Welsh has always been spoken, but it's now the national language of Wales. Catalan is the language of Catalonia. Basque is being revived and is becoming the language of the Basque country. There are also cultural revivals, traditional folklore, dance, music, cultural patterns. They're also reviving.
But do you see English as becoming the dominant language of the globe? Is this inevitable, or would you say that different countries will evolve their own specific linguistic systems and work within them?
Yeah, it depends on, these are questions of global power. I mean, it could be that Chinese will become a major language of international communication, for example.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. नाजरीन, आपने प्रोफेसर चॉम्स्की की बातें सुनी. अब चलिए हम पाकिस्तानी माहिरीन की बात सुनते हैं.